Hello there, you are welcome to another episode of ToThePointCode. In this episode, we will look at how to connect an Expo React Native application to a Backend API. This is the fourth part of our Expo React Native login system series. So far, we've been able to set up our login and sign up screens and also set up movement between the screens using React navigation. So basically at this point, our front-end application is separate on its own, and also we have a backend server that we want to connect to. We created this backend server in some previous videos before this series. We made use of NodeJS and Express and also added mongodb as the database. We then went on to host this application on Heroku. So if you want to do exactly what we'll be doing in this episode, you need to go and watch those videos first. Without wasting anyone's time, let's get started. So first of all, since we have a separate front-end application and a back-end application, we want to link them. And to link them, we need an API client. This client will make sure that you can make requests from the front end, and this request will get to the back end. And also whatever response that the back end generates will be returned to us. So for this application, we'll be using Axios as the API client. So let's install it on the command line. Now let's import Axios into the login.js file. Before the installation, I cancelled the Metro server, so let's make sure that it's running. So before we proceed, let's look at the behavior of our API in Postman. So for the sign up, we see that it takes an object containing the details of the user, and when you sign up successfully, we see that a status is returned, a message, and also the data you just signed up with, and the new ID is added to it. For the sign-in, it's very similar. When you supply the email and the password, the sign-in processes, and when it's successful, it returns the status, a message, and also the data. But the data of the sign-in is an array, while the data returned by the sign-up is just an object. So now let's copy the link for the sign-in and start with the sign-in process. So inside the login component, we'll create a method and call it handle login. Now inside the handle login, we want to take in the credentials. Also, let's create a variable and assign the link we copied to it. Now if you remember, the request in our Postman are post request. So we use the post method available on Axios to send the request. The first parameter will be the link to the API, followed by the credentials. And this will return a promise. And we also want to handle it for any errors. If we get a response from our request, the data that we saw in Postman can be found in response.data. So we fetch that and store it as our result. Now from this data, if you remember clearly, we had status, message, and also a data. So we can destructure that from the result. Now at this point, if the login was successful, you want to move on to the welcome page. Else, if there was an error message, we want to display the error message to the user. And remember that we created a portion here that we want to display our error messages there. So to display the messages that we have, we'll create a state variable to store the message. Also, we have two types of messages. The message can be an error message or a success message. So we want to have another state variable to monitor the type of message. Now let's create another function to handle the message. This function will take in the message and the type. Once it has the message, it will set the message as the value of our message state variable, and also it will set the type as the type. Now if no type is provided, we want to assume that it's a failed message, so we want to set a default value of failed. Now let's scroll down to the message box. Now inside the message box, we want to output the message. Also want to supply a type property to it. And this will be the value of the message type. Now let's visit our styles.js file to style the message differently based on the message type. Now we want to add a color property. For the value, let's check for the message type. So if the types applied to the message is success, we want to return a color of green, otherwise we'll return red. So now back in the handle login function, let's check for the value of the status. If the status is not equal to success, we want to set an error message. So make use of the handle message function. We'll use the message coming from the server and the status as well. Else if the message is successful, we want to move to the welcome page. And while moving to the welcome page, we want to pass the data that was received from the server. So we spread the value of the data. But for the sign in, it returns an array, so we target the first element of the array. For the catch block, we also want to send an error message. So when our code gets to the catch block, it's likely that the person's internet is very slow. So we'll put out a message for the person to check the network and try again. Now when the user clicks on the login button, instead of just running in the background and moving to the welcome page, we want to show some form of activity. So make use of the activity indicator, and we'll get this from React Native. Or how do we know when to show the activity indicator? So Format comes with an inbuilt state known as a submitting and also set submitting. With the submitting state, it is set to true whenever we press on the submit button, and we can use the set submitting function to set the value of a submitting. So let's combine the two to know when to show the activity indicator. So we can get the submitting value from the inner function of the format component. So once the submitting is false, we want to return the regular login button. Let's copy and paste this so that we make changes for the opposite. Now if a submitting is true, we want to get rid of the unpressed attribute and then replace the text with an activity indicator. We'll give it a size and a color. For the color, we'll give it primary. Also, let's attach disabled equals true. This will ensure that the button does not respond to any presses while it is loading. Now we can see that the activity indicator is shown because I pressed the login button not long ago. Now inside on submit property, let's make use of the handle login function. So we can get rid of the console.log. We can also get rid of the navigation. Now before we submit, we want to ensure that none of the input fields are empty. So let's check for them. If any of them is empty, we want to set a message. Now right after setting the message, we want to set the submitting to false. So in addition to the values, we can take in the set submitting function, and that comes as a property, so we have to destructure it. So after the handle message, we can set submitting to false. You can go ahead to send a request to the handle login function. Here we pass the values and also we pass the set submitting function. Now inside the handle login, let's make some few changes. Right after we are done with the then block, we want to set submitting to false. First of all, let's take it in as a parameter. Also after we have an error, we want to set submitting to false. One more thing we want to do is clear the message field whenever the button is pressed, so that the old message that was displayed will not be there. So for that, we'll set handle message to now whenever the button is pressed. Now let's save and open our application again. Wait, before we go, I misspelled success, so let's correct that. Yes, and we are good. So now let's try it out. First, we'll leave the input fields blank and press on the login button. Once we do that, we see that the error message is being displayed. Now let's input some actual credentials. When we click on the login, we see that the activity indicator is working. Now let's wait for the result. Now let's visit Postman and look at the correct credentials. So once we have that in mind, let's try and log in again. We see that since these credentials are correct, we are moved to the welcome page right after logging in. Now when we are on the welcome page, we want to display the details of the current user here. So let's go to the welcome.js file and make some few changes. So in addition to the navigation, we'll take in the route property. With this property, we'll be able to access the data that was passed while we're navigating to this page. So right at the top of the component, let's destructure the email and the name. We will do this from route.params, that is parameters. Now I'll put the values as options to the text that we have. We are doing this to ensure that for the time being, if you visit the welcome components directly without passing through the navigation, no error will be thrown. So now let's try the login again. Now we see that the current user's name and email are being displayed over here. Now let's do the same for the sign up page. So in the login.js file, we copy the handle message function and also the handle login function. In addition to that, let's copy the message states. Now let's paste it in the signup.js file. Let's cut the state to the top. Now let's change the name of the function to handle signup. Also, we change the ending of the link to signup. Now also in the navigation section, the data we receive is no longer an array, so let's get rid of the index. And everything else stays the same. Now let's go back to the login.js file and copy the content of our onSubmit function. Let's add the set submitting to the values. Now if you go back to the postman, we see that for the sign up, the key for the full name is name instead of full name. So let's change that in the sign up component. So we change the key for the full name to name. And we'll do that in the input folder as well. Now you have to check if none of the fields are empty. So let's copy and paste this. So we check for the other fields. Also, right after this, we want to check if the confirmed password and also the password are equal. So before the last else block, we will add an else if. We want to set an error message. And I will change the called function to handle signup. So on the signup page as well, we want to make use of the activity indicator. So let's import it. Also, before we forget, let's copy the message box from the login.js file. Now for the button, we'll do something similar to this, so let's copy it. Now let's take in the submitting property. So now let's try out the sign up. First of all, let's leave everything blank and sign up. Once we do that, we see the error message. Now let's try something. Now it still says we should fill out the fields. That means we made a mistake somewhere, so let's fix it. So it turns out, because our date of birth field is not a conventional input field, Formic was not able to capture the values, so we have to manually add the date of birth value to the values. So let's do that. To do that, we just add the date of birth to the values object. First of all, we spread the values that we have and go on to add the date of birth. Remember, the DOB is the state that we created to store the value of the date of birth. So apparently we forgot to import Axios. So let's import Axios. Now once we refresh our app, we should be able to send the request successfully. Now we see that our sign up is working successfully, and the email and the name on the page have been updated as well.